It's commonly believed that Leonardo da Vinci was a genius,
Genius.
Great genius.
but the reality is more nuanced. He was a genius, yet perhaps not in the way one might typically imagine. This might sound confusing, but consider an example. In the late 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci completed The Last Supper, a highly significant work. Centuries later, a supposed coded message was discovered within this fresco. From the perceived mystery of the image to other concealed secrets, Leonardo is often seen as not just a genius, but also an enigma. This perception inspired Dan Brown to write the well-known book The Da Vinci Code, which Hollywood subsequently adapted into a blockbuster film. However, the reality behind secret codes, messages, ciphers is that The Last Supper began to deteriorate and peel from the wall merely 20 years after its completion. Leonardo, despite his genius, made an error with the paints. The mixture he concocted did not adhere effectively to the surface. The notion of mysterious, hidden messages within the fresco is solely a product of conspiracy theories. The Da Vinci Code is a work of fiction. Though it is engaging, thrilling, and novel, it remains fiction. This revelation does not diminish Da Vinci's accomplishments. The Last Supper is undeniably a masterpiece. Today, we will delve into the life of an outsider, an illegitimate craftsman who lacked formal education, yet whom posterity would ultimately recognize as one of history's greatest geniuses. This is the biography of an artist, engineer, scientist, producer, designer, and notably, a fervent admirer of pink attire. Let's begin with an unexpected point. You're familiar with Da Vinci's famous self-portrait, aren't you? Or is it perhaps a portrait painted by one of his students? Or even one created many years after the artist's death? What these images share is a depiction of age, and while many aspects of Leonardo's life remain unknown even today, one fact is certain: Da Vinci was not born a 60-year-old sage. He wasn't some NBA stock market mogul. So, what did young Leonardo look like? Most likely, he looked like this. This is a sketch prepared for one of the statues by Leonardo's teacher, who probably used his student as a model. This image aligns with the scarce accounts from those who knew the young Da Vinci. They described him as a handsome, athletic man with long, curly hair. But the most intriguing detail from these accounts concerns Leonardo's clothing, a knee-length pink tunic. His contemporaries were surprised less by the color and more by the length, as most preferred floor-length attire. Leonardo maintained this distinctive style throughout his life, and clothing would become one of his primary expenditures. His favorite colors were pink and red, as indicated by purchase records found in Da Vinci's diaries. Incidentally, 3/4 of his diaries are lost, but the surviving portion, combined with contemporary accounts, is sufficient to debunk myths and realize that Leonardo da Vinci was far from the figure people often imagine. For many children, being born out of wedlock would have foretold a grim future filled with hardship and suffering. For Leonardo, however, it was a stroke of luck. In the early 14th century, his ancestors settled in the Italian town of Vinci. For over a century, nearly all the men in the family were notaries, including 24-year-old Piero. He met a woman named Caterina, and sometime later, a boy named Leonardo was born. This was in 1452, and the boy seemed destined for a life as a notary. However, Caterina was the orphan daughter of a farmer, while Piero was already establishing a successful notary career in Florence. A marriage between individuals from such disparate backgrounds was improbable at the time, thus Leonardo was born illegitimate. In mid-15th century Italy, this status did not render one a second-class citizen, but it often curtailed privileges, primarily the ability to inherit the family trade. In Da Vinci's situation, this proved to be a boon for everyone, the family and the young offspring. His inclination to procrastinate and shift attention rapidly would have made Leonardo a terrible notary. 8 months after his son's birth, Piero da Vinci married the daughter of a prominent Florentine shoemaker. He would live a long life, marry several more times, and father 11 additional children. Piero continued to communicate with Leonardo and could theoretically have acknowledged him as his son, but he never did. For Leonardo's mother, Caterina, a suitable husband was found among local farmers, and she soon had 4 children of her own. Leonardo spent his early childhood primarily in the town of Vinci, residing in his grandfather's house. Let's pause for a moment. Do you know what the famous actor DiCaprio and the great artist Da Vinci have in common? Firstly, the mother of the future Hollywood star named her son after the renowned artist. Secondly, a major Hollywood film about the great painter's life is currently in development, with Leonardo DiCaprio cast in the lead role. But most importantly, the surnames Da Vinci and DiCaprio share a common origin story. In 15th and 16th century Italy, many individuals began registering their place of birth as their surname. Thus, the names of both his father, Piero, and Leonardo himself acquired the Da Vinci edition. As an illegitimate child, Leonardo did not attend one of the prestigious schools that provided a comprehensive education. Instead, the boy received a brief education in basic mathematics and otherwise pursued self-education. As a consequence, the future genius would struggle to learn Latin as an adult and would write it with errors. Conversely, practical application and experimentation became his primary methods for understanding the world. At the age of 12, Leonardo left Vinci and relocated to Florence to live with his father. Florence at that time was a bustling center of commerce, technology, and, most notably, art. Constant festivals and fashionable people filled the streets. In short, it was a vibrant big city life. The renowned Medici family, particularly Lorenzo da Medici, held significant influence. For many artists, Lorenzo served as a patron, or more simply, someone who generously provided commissions and financial support. There had never been a more opportune time and place to be born a bastard. While you might lack a formal education, inheritance, or a family profession, you certainly possessed freedom, the freedom to shape your life as you desired. At the very least, you could become an artist. Leonardo was also fortunate to be born during the zenith of the Renaissance, a period when superstar artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, and, of course, Leonardo da Vinci were creating. All these individuals would later inspire the names of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. After moving to Florence, Leonardo da Vinci continued his rather superficial education, primarily focusing on the fundamentals of mathematics. The student was notable for his left-handedness. While not explicitly condemned, this trait certainly distinguished the boy from others. This characteristic would later manifest in his drawing technique and his unique approach to writing. Around his early 30s, Leonardo began keeping detailed diaries. He predominantly wrote about anatomy, engineering, physics, and art, and very rarely about his personal life. The entries are written in mirror writing, from right to left, meaning one ideally needs a mirror to read them. This fact is often interpreted as further evidence of Da Vinci's mysteriousness. Supposedly, he deliberately encrypted everything to prevent others from reading it. However, this appears to be a myth. Let's start with the obvious. Why would one encrypt conclusions about the sun not revolving around the Earth in the 15th century? It's clear why you'd encrypt information about apricots bought at the market or recently purchased stockings less so. Stockings were ordinary men's clothing at the time, so there was no need for discretion. The true reason for the mirror writing is likely his left-handedness. When writing left-handed from left to right, there's a risk of smudging the ink with one's sleeve or palm, and paper was expensive. Even when Leonardo was financially secure, he filled every available inch of a page with information. An Italian calligraphy book from the 15th century actually offers a tip for left-handers: write in mirror script. Other left-handed contemporaries of Da Vinci wrote in the same manner. And if you believe mirror writing is exclusively for geniuses, try it, I assure you. It's not as difficult as it seems. It's simply a matter of practice. The fact that Leonardo primarily studied mathematics in Florence might suggest that his father, Piero, hoped his son would become a notary. However, by this point, it was evident Leonardo da Vinci was far more interested in drawing than in paperwork. There's a well-known anecdote about a painted wooden shield, which can be considered the future genius's first work. The story goes that a carpenter from Vinci asked Leonardo's father to take a wooden shield to Florence for painting, but Piero entrusted the task to his son. Leonardo decided to paint either a fire-breathing dragon or Medusa Gorgon and, to achieve this, studied real creatures like lizards, snakes, grasshoppers, and others. When the completed work was presented, Piero da Vinci was so impressed by his son's talent that he kept the shield for himself and purchased a simpler replacement for the carpenter. Whether this story is entirely accurate is uncertain. It might just be a legend, but one thing is certain. Studying the real world to bring fantasies to life was an approach Leonardo maintained throughout his life. Perhaps due to his inclination toward drawing, Piero abandoned the idea of legitimizing his son and making him a notary. Instead, he took the teenager to a friend and client, the renowned artist Verrocchio. In the 15th century, Verrocchio was essentially a craftsman, and his workshop operated as a production line. Under the master's supervision, apprentice assistants churned out paintings with religious themes. However, this establishment effectively served as a true school for many artists, including Leonardo da Vinci. Let's pause to clarify an important detail. Painting was not considered art, at least not by most people in the 15th century. The prevailing logic was this: what originates from the mind is art. What is produced with hands is craft. Poetry was considered art, sculpture was a craft, music was art, and painting, well, you understand. This system, rooted in ancient Greece, satisfied everyone for a long time. Everything changed thanks to the Renaissance and, in part, Leonardo da Vinci. Artists of that era, particularly from Italy, elevated visual art to a new echelon. They delved into anatomy, perspective, geometry, and physics with a singular objective: to depict 3D reality on a 2D canvas as accurately as possible. A simple illustration. On the left, a typical 14th century Trecento painting. On the right, one of Leonardo's first famous works. The distinction is evident, whether you are an art historian or simply someone with eyes. The painting on the right is the Baptism of Christ. To be precise, it is a work by Verrocchio with contributions from his student Leonardo da Vinci. By this time, the artist was in his early 20s and had spent nearly 5 years in the workshop. He was no longer merely an apprentice, but a full-fledged worker residing at the studio. This meant Leonardo could not only handle assembly line commissions, but also collaborate with the master on his own projects. And he did so successfully, even surpassing his teacher. Take the Baptism of Christ as an example. On the left are 2 angels that are of particular interest, because one of them was painted by Da Vinci. If you are viewing this on a screen larger than a phone, you can probably intuitively guess. The angel on the left is Leonardo's. It is far more lifelike and natural, almost in motion, unlike the static, statue-like figure. According to legend, the difference between the angels was so striking to contemporaries that Verrocchio conceded defeat to his student and eventually abandoned painting. Whether this is true is unknown, but what is certain is that Verrocchio essentially completed no independent works after the Baptism of Christ. At this juncture, Leonardo's story might resemble a typical narrative of emerging talent rising to prominence, if not for his encounter with prison. A week before his 24th birthday, Da Vinci was accused of sodomy. He and 3 other men were allegedly observed in an intimate relationship with a young man named Saltarelli. The accusation was anonymous, but an investigation commenced. Homosexual relationships in Florence at the time were a crime, and each year, several hundred individuals were sentenced to imprisonment, exile, or even death. But Leonardo was fortunate. While he likely spent a day or two in jail, it quickly became apparent that the other accused were connected to the Medici clan. The case was dismissed, and the suspects were released. Was Da Vinci guilty? Probably not. There is no mention of Leonardo ever having relationships with women, but there are indications of relationships with men. With one of his partners, he would spend over 20 years. Sodomy was a crime in 15th century Florence, but among local artists, it was a common phenomenon. Botticelli was accused of sodomy, and Michelangelo, Donatello, and Cellini were likely not heterosexual either. Leonardo did not overtly flaunt his personal life, but he also did not conceal his orientation. Legal troubles did not impede Leonardo's work at Verrocchio's studio. He continued to study how nature functions and how the human eye perceives it. This led to Da Vinci's renowned unique painting style. Two Italian terms are crucial here: chiaroscuro and sfumato. Simply put, we perceive the world in 3 dimensions, but a canvas is a 2-dimensional space. How does one make a human figure appear 3-dimensional and distinct from the background? Primarily through light and shadow. This is the chiaroscuro technique. Roughly speaking, you can see an example of this technique in my frame. That subtle light in the background creates the illusion of 3-dimensionality on a 2D screen. That's why it's there. Today, virtually every vlogger who cares about their image employs this, but in the 15th century, it was a significant advancement in painting. Chiaroscuro was not exclusive to Da Vinci, but he mastered it brilliantly. Another hallmark of the genius is sfumato, or the smoky effect. Objects lack sharp outlines, replaced by smooth transitions of light and shadow. This makes figures on the canvas appear alive, not like frozen statues. Da Vinci employed his signature sfumato throughout his entire career, from the angel in the Baptism of Christ to the Mona Lisa. Now, I suspect some of you might be thinking, dude, you said at the beginning that Leonardo wasn't such a genius, but so far, it sounds exactly like that. A teenager enters a workshop as an apprentice and quickly becomes a great artist. That's true. By his mid-20s, Leonardo managed to gain recognition, and his work started to be noticed. But that doesn't mean everything he produced was flawless. A clear example is the Annunciation. Painted while still working under Verrocchio, it exhibits obvious imperfections: the unnatural hands of the Virgin Mary, a bulky pedestal, and a garden fence that distracts from the main subject, among others. This only signifies one thing: if Da Vinci was a genius, he became one much later. He was not born a genius. At 24, Leonardo was still working and living in Verrocchio's workshop, producing religious paintings. By that time, many of the master's apprentices had already become independent artists. Why Leonardo finally decided to venture out on his own is unknown. Perhaps the sodomy accusations from the previous year played a role. Either way, in 1477, Leonardo opened his own workshop in Florence. From a business standpoint, it was a disaster. Over 5 years, Leonardo received only 3 commissions, 2 of which he never completed, and the 3rd he didn't even begin. In the history of art, there's a sort of ranking of unfinished masterpieces, and Leonardo's painting, Adoration of the Magi, has every right to top that list. Da Vinci received this commission from a monastery thanks to his father Piero's connections. Adoration of the Magi is a well-known biblical subject, and many great artists had tackled it. By the time he received the commission, Da Vinci was already notorious as an undisciplined artist, known for broken promises and missed deadlines. Therefore, Leonardo was compelled to sign a very strict contract. After that, Da Vinci intensified his perfectionism. He created a detailed sketch, calculated perspective, and designed the background. In his view, no character's pose in the painting should be repeated, and there are dozens of figures. Each character experiences an emotion that must be conveyed through their movement, hand positions, and facial expression. Moreover, Da Vinci first drew everyone naked. He believed in an anatomical approach, where bodies were drawn first, and clothing was added later. Where did he obtain all this information? By studying anatomy, geometry, geology, and physics. Da Vinci sought to understand every detail of the world around him to transfer it to the canvas. Perfectionism may have made Da Vinci great, but it also undoubtedly prevented him from finishing what he started. Today, he is credited with only 15 works, not many for an artist who lived a long life. Adoration of the Magi, of course, was not completed on time. The contract was terminated and Leonardo fell into debt. The future genius borrowed money and, according to records, he spent it on paints and a bottle of wine. At that point, Da Vinci was clearly in a crisis, and while he was considered a talented artist, his reputation ruined everything. He received no commissions, while his colleague Botticelli was inundated with work, and Leonardo criticized his technique. Perhaps it was envy, who knows? Either way, today, Adoration of the Magi hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and every visitor can observe a young man on the side. It is believed to be a self-portrait of Leonardo. Perhaps this is how he looked in 1482 when he left his native Florence and moved to Milan. Da Vinci celebrated his 30th birthday in a new city and in a new capacity. He was no longer an artist, but an engineer-architect capable of designing almost anything, from buildings to military weapons. This is according to a letter from Leonardo himself to the ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. In this resume, Da Vinci listed a long array of his engineering skills, and only in the 11th point noted, "Oh, and I can paint too." It's difficult to say what prompted this career shift, perhaps exhaustion from painting, where, despite his recognized talent, a trail of unfinished works followed him, maybe a desire to finally dedicate more time to science, which Leonardo had begun passionately studying in Florence, or it was a tactical move. Milan, Venice, Florence, and other Italian cities were independent states at the time. Da Vinci likely knew that Sforza was a militaristic leader surrounded by enemies. Such a ruler needed a military engineer, not an artist. So, what did Da Vinci do in his first few years in Milan? He worked as a producer and director. In an era without YouTube or Netflix, the elite still required entertainment, especially if you were nobility. Da Vinci organized theatrical performances at Sforza's court. One might think this was a step down for a talented artist, but Leonardo disagreed. He designed the plot, scenography, music, and special effects, people flying on stage, dragons, and demons. Da Vinci had begun working on theatrical performances back in Florence, but he truly excelled in Milan. Despite his mythical image as a mysterious genius, Leonardo was actually someone who enjoyed festivals, celebrations, vibrant clothing, and humor. For example, he might catch a lizard, attach a beard and wings to it, place it in a box, and then startle his friends with it. So, Leonardo was also a prankster. Furthermore, he was handsome, possessed an athletic build, spoke articulately, and sang and played music beautifully. In short, organizing theatrical performances was the perfect job for someone with these qualities. Most importantly, in this role, Leonardo fully utilized his engineering skills. And now it's time to debunk another myth. If you travel to Rome, you'll likely land at Leonardo da Vinci Airport. There's a colossal statue of the genius there, bronze, 12 meters tall. But that's not the intriguing part. In his hand, Da Vinci holds a model of his helicopter. That's what's interesting. There's a belief that Leonardo was so brilliant that he designed many modern technologies 500 years ago, from tanks to helicopters. This isn't entirely false, but it's far from the complete truth. The helicopter design in Da Vinci's diaries is real, but it seems it was created for one of his performances, and the device could not fly. The construction itself is non-functional. The design for human flight wings in his diary is real. As a theatrical effect, brilliant. As an actual invention, it doesn't work. This is a typical narrative for the engineering projects found in the genius's diaries. Some were created solely for performances, while others were never realized by Leonardo in practice, existing only on paper. Okay, there are a couple of exceptions, but we'll get to those later. So, Leonardo was a successful producer in Milan. It was here that he met a young man named Salai, much younger than Leonardo. Salai became the master's assistant, later a decent artist, but most importantly, Leonardo's partner, with whom he spent nearly 30 years of his life. In his diaries, Da Vinci left notes about the clothing he bought for Salai and even brief mentions of their arguments. It's after moving to Milan that Da Vinci began keeping diaries consistently. He rarely wrote about his personal life. The main focus of his notes was art and science. As you may recall, Leonardo essentially had no formal education, including a solid knowledge of Latin, and most scientific works of the time were in Latin, not the Italian Da Vinci was comfortable with. But Leonardo did not despair. His sources of knowledge were observation, experimentation, and personal communication. Milan was a much better city for this. Science received far more attention there than in Florence. A common myth about Da Vinci is the image of a solitary genius creator. Once, Leonardo wrote in his diary, "Only when you are alone do you fully belong to yourself." But in reality, this was the kind of solitude known only to its owner, not to those around him. Da Vinci had to have many friends, students, and business connections, as this was a key component of his success. There was always room for architects, scientists, engineers, and artists at the gatherings at Sforza's court. Leonardo was a frequent participant in these events. For him, and for many other figures of the Renaissance, this intellectual exchange between representatives of different fields of science and art was an important source of knowledge. In the 1480s, a popular topic for discussion was the Vitruvian Man. Let's be honest. I'm not the only one who's seen this image countless times, but never fully understood what this naked guy inscribed in a square is all about, right? Let's clarify. Marcus Vitruvius was an ancient Roman engineer and architect. He authored a famous treatise on ancient architecture. The Renaissance was a period of revived ancient culture. For Da Vinci and his contemporaries, Vitruvius's concept of the relationship between the microcosm of man and the macrocosm of the planet resonated particularly deeply. In simple terms, the human body is a world in miniature. Everything in the body is structured and functions according to the same laws as the surrounding space. According to Vitruvius, for example, a well-proportioned human body could serve as a model for designing a building. His treatise describes the exact proportions of that well-proportioned body. Many of Leonardo's friends began drawing their own versions of the Vitruvian Man. However, Da Vinci's version became the most famous. Firstly, it is better drawn. Secondly, Vitruvius's concept was a central theme in Leonardo's scientific and philosophical pursuits. And thirdly, there's a theory that it's a self-portrait of Da Vinci. If so, we can roughly imagine how Leonardo looked at 38. And he looked, apparently, awesome. I didn't have that kind of physique at 28, and at 38, zero chance. Perhaps the reason lies in the genius's lifestyle. According to contemporaries, Leonardo was an athletic man who enjoyed riding horses and other physical activities. On top of that, Da Vinci was a vegetarian. Judging by his diaries, he had a great affection for animals. His purchase records mention only fruits, vegetables, and fish. One note reads, "Went to the market, bought apricots and eels." Moreover, Leonardo did not overwork. He understood that serving the muses did not tolerate haste. Creativity and intellectual work required time and a schedule. I don't know who the villain was that said an artist must be hungry, but Da Vinci would definitely disagree. In his view, an artist should reside in a pleasant space, wear beautiful clothes, and paint virtuous images. All these luxuries became available to Leonardo when he received a commission to create a massive statue for Ludovico Sforza. It was 1489, around the same time he drew the Vitruvian Man. The statue was intended to depict Sforza's father on horseback. The father quickly ceased to interest da Vinci. Instead, he focused entirely on the horse. And it wouldn't be Leonardo if he just made an ordinary horse, not outstanding, not unique, just a horse completed on time. You can't simply not intensify the perfectionism. First, da Vinci visited stables to study live horses, their poses, movements, and expressions. Then he moved on to dead horses to understand the animal's anatomy. Okay, the design was ready, now it needed to be executed. The statue had to be bronze and enormous. But despite its size, da Vinci wanted to cast it in one piece, not in parts. To do that, he simply needed to invent a new technology. 5 years passed. French troops advanced on Milan, and all the bronze intended for the statue was used to make cannons. The French would capture the city, but not at this time, a bit later. Soldiers would use the giant horse model for target practice with arrows, and all Leonardo wanted was to create a good statue. Around the same time, Columbus and Vespucci discovered America, printing technology advanced, and significant scientific discoveries were made. And, of course, da Vinci was not solely working on the ill-fated horse sculpture. This period was one of the most productive for Leonardo as a scientist. When asked which discipline he preferred, he responded, yes, geometry, arithmetic, optics, engineering, mechanics, chemistry, anatomy, and that's not all. Perhaps the main quality da Vinci possessed was curiosity. Whether this was due to a lack of education or a natural trait is unknown. But what is certain is the vast list of questions that intrigued Leonardo, from why the sky is blue to the structure of a woodpecker's tongue. You didn't mishear. Studying a woodpecker's tongue was a typical daily plan that Leonardo noted in his diary. And we'll return to that. Luck played a significant role in the making of a genius. For example, in the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg in Germany invented printing, and by the end of the century, one of his students opened a printing press in Venice. They printed in Italian, which was accessible to da Vinci, unlike the daunting Latin. This provided Leonardo with access to a vast number of scientific works. But as we know, theory alone does not yield results without practice. Experiments and observations remained vital for da Vinci's method of understanding. In an era when everyone asked why, Leonardo asked, why not? Da Vinci attempted to create a perpetual motion machine, studied physics, and even formulated something resembling the laws of mechanics. He concluded that a perpetual motion machine was impossible. No big deal, he moved on. Da Vinci designed several military projects, including a giant 20-meter tall crossbow or a tank resembling a turtle, which, according to Leonardo's idea, up to 8 people should be inside. These inventions remained concepts. The genius's true passion was flight devices, first as theatrical props, then as actual projects. His diaries contain numerous designs for flying machines, most resembling birds. Despite decades of searching, Leonardo never succeeded in creating a working model. Studying various disciplines, Leonardo quickly realized the necessity of mathematics, the language in which nature writes its laws. And this is where he faced difficulties. His biggest issues were with algebra and arithmetic. Even at 40, he could make mistakes in basic calculations and struggle with roots and other algebraic elements. It's comforting to know I share something in common with Leonardo da Vinci. I also had significant problems with square roots in school, and I'd never even heard of cubic ones. Unlike algebra, geometry was much more intuitive for da Vinci, as he perceived the world through visual images. Leonardo spent years working on various theories in this field, but for mathematicians, these explorations held little value. Perhaps da Vinci's main contribution to this science was the illustrations for a book by his friend Luca Pacioli, a renowned mathematician of the time. The work was primarily devoted to the most famous mathematical proportion, the golden ratio. The discipline whose influence on da Vinci's work cannot be overstated is anatomy. Leonardo began studying anatomy back in Florence simply to paint people better, but in Milan, This passion extended far beyond artistic necessity. Connections with medical scholars granted Leonardo access to research, but even more importantly, to cadavers. Da Vinci would become the one who elevated anatomical drawing to new heights. His depictions are scientifically accurate and artistically stunning. Light and shadow, his signature sfumato, all executed by a great master. Leonardo would be the first to accurately depict and describe the structure of teeth. So, if not for all his other achievements, Da Vinci could have earned a respectable place in the history of dentistry. Some of his anatomical theories could have become scientific discoveries, but they remained ideas on paper. However, studying anatomy, while it didn't cement Leonardo's place in scientific history, certainly brought him closer to answering the question of how to convey a character's emotional state through their movement. Famous portraits, Lady with an Ermine, La Belle Ferronnière, Mona Lisa, all entered history largely for one reason. Through the subtlest details of pose and facial expression, the artist conveyed the thoughts and inner state of the subject. To achieve this, it required not only the mastery of a painter honed over years of practice, but also decades of studying anatomy. For example, let's briefly examine one painting, and you'll forever understand why Leonardo da Vinci is a great artist, even if you draw cucumbers with dashes instead of people. This is the famous Lady with an Ermine, perhaps the second most popular portrait by da Vinci after the Mona Lisa. Leonardo worked on it around the same time as his horse statue. The painting depicts the mistress of the ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. Using this work as an example, it's interesting to analyze several key points that da Vinci discovered in the process of perfecting his craft. These discoveries helped him create masterpieces back then, and today they can be useful for anyone looking to improve their Instagram photos. Instagram tip from Leonardo number 1. Overly bright light falling on the face makes it unflattering. It's much better when the light is soft, with sunset being the ideal option. Instagram tip from Leonardo number 2. The body and head should be slightly turned, with the angle of the torso and head differing. This makes the pose as beautiful and natural as possible. In short, Da Vinci figured out 500 years ago why passport photos look terrible. Genius. And these are far from all the merits of Lady with an Ermine. One important detail is the facial expression, the subtle smile, Da Vinci's signature. You can observe it in many of his works, including the Mona Lisa. A small detail of expression that, for a genius, seems easy to depict. Yet, the average person cannot even imagine how many years Da Vinci spent with the scalpel over the faces of the deceased, studying every muscle responsible for a smile. Da Vinci's perfectionism is also evident in the detailed rendering of fabrics, hair, and the animal's fur. To avoid spending another hour analyzing this painting, here's one small detail that proves we're dealing with a genius. Look at the heroine's pinky finger. It's darkened because it's in shadow, but the very bottom part of the finger is slightly lighter. Why? Because the main light source is positioned to the right and above, because this light falls on the white fur of the ermine, because the white fur reflects this light, and it hits the lower part of the pinky, making it lighter. Because Da Vinci spent decades studying the nature of light. Because Da Vinci made himself a genius, at least in painting. During this period, Da Vinci would create several more famous works, but it's Lady with an Ermine that, centuries later, would be called the first modern portrait in history. The first work of painting where the artist managed to convey the inner emotions of the subject. For Leonardo, this was an undeniable success, not only because poets began dedicating verses to the painting. Contemporaries noted the unquestionable merit of Lady with an Ermine. It was Leonardo's first painting commission in 7 years of living in Milan. Leonardo is great. Anne. The ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, decided to immortalize his name and create a mausoleum for himself and his family. The chosen location was not the grandest, but charming in its own way, the Milanese church of Santa Maria del Grazie. However, this place would go down in history not for its architecture, but for another reason. It was there, on one of the walls, that Da Vinci would paint The Last Supper. The immense popularity of this work also owes a debt to another person, Dan Brown. In 2003, he published the famous book The Da Vinci Code. In it, the writer, or rather his characters, speculate about hidden symbols in the fresco The Last Supper painted by Leonardo. Everyone has seen this fresco, many are aware of its mysteries, and only a few know the details. Well, let's increase the number of those in the know. Leonardo received a commission to paint a wall in the church of Santa Maria del Grazie and chose a well-known biblical subject, Jesus announcing to the 12 apostles that one of them is a traitor. Da Vinci aimed to capture the apostles' reactions to Christ's words. The work process was public. Firstly, the space where the fresco was being painted was essentially a dining hall for monks. Secondly, anyone could walk in from the street and observe the genius at work. Often, visitors found neither work nor genius. There were fortunate days when Leonardo arrived early and worked until late at night. There were unfortunate days when Da Vinci stood in front of the fresco, silent, sometimes criticizing his own work, silent again, and after a couple of hours of self-flagellation, left. There were worse days when Leonardo showed up around lunchtime, made a couple of brush strokes, put down the brush, and departed. The genius's procrastination became a topic of discussion between the church's praetor and Ludovico Sforza. Da Vinci defended himself, explaining to Sforza that an artist works even when not wielding a brush. Thoughts and images must first form in the mind before they can take shape on canvas. Da Vinci also threatened to depict the prior as Judas if he didn't cease his tirades. This greatly amused Sforza, who decided not to pressure Leonardo, at least for a while. In 1497, Sforza's wife died, his patience ran out, and he compelled Da Vinci to sign a strict contract. By that time, the fresco had been in progress for 3 years. Leonardo would require another year to complete it, but in the end, the wait was worthwhile. The work was immediately recognized by contemporaries as a masterpiece. Da Vinci received a bonus from Sforza in the form of a small vineyard. The end, but not quite. Within 20 years, The Last Supper began to peel off the wall. Who is to blame? A fresco must be painted quickly, a section of the wall is covered with wet plaster, and while it dries, the paint is applied. The artist has one day for this. Leonardo, as you might guess, disliked rushing. He was accustomed to working with oil paints, which allowed him to paint a picture over years, applying the tiniest strokes and making adjustments. All of Da Vinci's previous successes in painting were tied to this approach. So, for The Last Supper, he decided to use an experimental mix. He took tempera, typically used for frescoes, mixed it with oil paint, and applied it to a dry surface. This allowed him to work in his unhurried manner, but it led to an unfortunate result. Over the past 500 years, The Last Supper has undergone many restorations, none of which have been very successful. Today, in Santa Maria del Grazie, you'll see only a faint resemblance of what the fresco was immediately after its completion. But that's enough to appreciate the scale of Da Vinci's genius. Though, let's be honest, given the current global situation, an image on the internet is all we have access to now. In brief, why is The Last Supper a masterpiece? It's the characters and the composition. Decades of studying anatomy and extensive experience as a theater producer allowed Da Vinci to capture the reaction of each apostle to Jesus' words with utmost precision. Take this trio, for example. Judas is leaning back, holding a bag of silver coins. In a gesture, he spills salt. His actions, pose, and expression betray him as the traitor. Peter clutches a knife, ready to act, leaning forward to speak to John. John, on the other hand, is sorrowful and calm. He knows he is innocent. It's John who is the key figure in the conspiratorial theory that forms the basis of the Da Vinci Code. Allegedly, it's not John but Mary Magdalene, as he looks too much like a woman. However, depicting characters without pronounced gender traits was a hallmark of Leonardo's work, from the angel in Verrocchio's painting to the later portraits of John himself. A female figure in the fresco isn't the only mysterious theory tied to the Last Supper. Listing and debunking them all would take more than an hour, but none of these theories are taken seriously for one simple reason: lack of evidence. The signs that Da Vinci truly encoded in the fresco are tied to his skill and observation. For example, Jesus, seated in the center, is placed against a light background. Leonardo noticed that objects against a light background appear larger than against a dark one. Discussing perspective deserves a separate video. As you may recall, depicting depth and three-dimensionality was one of the main achievements of Renaissance artists, and The Last Supper is a prime example. The work on the fresco coincided with an important event in Leonardo's personal life. His mother, Caterina, arrived in Milan, as Leonardo noted in his diary. A year later, she died of malaria. In his notes, there are only a few dry lines about funeral expenses. Interestingly, he spent less on the funeral than on clothing. What does this suggest? Perhaps a lingering resentment toward his mother from childhood. Or perhaps she, a simple peasant, didn't desire an elaborate funeral. As with many events in Leonardo's life, little or nothing is known about this. What is certain is the career dead-end Leonardo found himself in. It would seem that after the success of The Last Supper, things should have taken off for the genius, but it was the opposite. By that time, he had comfortably settled in one of Milan's palaces, his home and studio, where not only Leonardo but also his students worked. To maintain this household, he needed commissions, but the only art that interested his main patron, Ludovico Sforza, at that moment was the art of war. The French were advancing on the city, the same ones who had come a few years earlier. With no commissions, Leonardo made ends meet by working as an interior designer. Leonardo was nearly 50, a recognized genius, and yet he was painting walls in private chambers. Even this he didn't complete, leaving amidst a scandal. His self-esteem, however, remained intact. In search of work, he began sending resumes to potential patrons. These letters often concluded with something like, "There is no better candidate for this job than Leonardo from Florence." That's how he was often referred to. In 1499, the French entered the city. Da Vinci did not flee. That wasn't his style. He considered staying and building connections with the new authorities, but eventually he departed. At the turn of the new century, he left Milan, where he had spent 18 years, to return to Florence. In the city he knew well, Da Vinci would celebrate his 50th birthday. For some, this age might signal the decline of a career, but for Da Vinci, the next 6 years in Florence would be the most productive of his life. He continued his scientific pursuits and began working on several masterpieces, including the Mona Lisa. In Florence, Da Vinci had star status, and he lived up to it. A stylish, middle-aged man in a pink outfit from a renowned tailor strolled slowly through the city streets. Next to him was an equally fashionable young man in his mid-30s, Leonardo, and his partner, Soleil. According to Da Vinci's diaries, his main expenses at the time were clothing and books. In Florence, Da Vinci established a workshop similar to that of his teacher, Verrocchio. Routine work, such as commissioned religious paintings, was handled by Leonardo's students. The master devoted his time only to projects that interested him. In 1503, Francesco del Giocondo, a wealthy silk merchant, approached Leonardo to commission a portrait of his wife, Lisa, who was 24 at the time. Why Da Vinci agreed is a mystery. At that time, he was engrossed in science and turned down commissions even from far more influential patrons. Perhaps his father, Piero, who had business ties with the client, played a role. Or maybe Leonardo needed money due to numerous rejections, as his bank account was nearly empty. Or perhaps it was that enigmatic smile Lisa del Giocondo possessed. For a long time, the identity of the woman in the painting was questioned. There were dozens of theories, ranging from it being a self-portrait of the artist to a depiction of his mother. All this perfectly fueled the image of the mysterious genius. Only in the mid-2000s were compelling pieces of evidence found confirming that the Mona Lisa is indeed a portrait of Lisa del Giocondo. However, neither she nor her husband would ever receive the completed commission, not in a year, not in 3, not in 10. Da Vinci would take it with him, first to another city, then to another country. He would work on it for 16 years, until his death. Taking on individual commissions was a decent way for an artist to earn a living, but true opportunities came from having a patron. A patron offered large projects, did so regularly, and, most importantly, paid generously. For Da Vinci in Milan, that patron was Sforza. In Florence, his place was taken by Cesare Borgia. Technically, not exactly in Florence. Here's the deal. Cesare Borgia would have been the perfect character in the Game of Thrones universe. In an era when many rulers were known for cruelty and ruthlessness, Cesare Borgia was perhaps the most cruel and ruthless of all. Murders, betrayals, executions, incest, and corruption. In short, a bloody tyrant in power. He conquered city after city and could have easily taken Florence. The famous Niccolò Machiavelli was dispatched to negotiate with Borgia and managed to strike a deal. There's a theory that one of the terms of the agreement was Da Vinci. Whether Leonardo's work for Borgia was a diplomatic gesture or his own initiative, he once again had the chance to prove himself as a military engineer. Da Vinci accompanied Borgia from city to city, advising and proposing ideas. However, despite designs for tanks, African crossbows, and diving suits, perhaps his greatest achievement in military matters was a single sheet of paper. To create a detailed map of the town of Imola, Leonardo applied his scientific knowledge from various fields and built a special measuring device, which he carried through the streets. For centuries to come, accurate maps would become a crucial tool in military campaigns. Da Vinci served Borgia for 6 months and left after another bloody act, during which someone Leonardo knew was executed. This raises a logical question. Why did Da Vinci, who repeatedly expressed his disdain for war in his diaries and was a vegetarian, work for such ruthless rulers as Sforza and Borgia? Some might say it was pragmatism. This gave Da Vinci access to ambitious projects. Freud might argue it was about fulfilling a father figure. Who's truly right, we may never know. Upon returning to Florence, Da Vinci undertook a new engineering project. You surely know the Italian town of Pisa, the one with the leaning tower. In the early 16th century, Florence's authorities wanted to bring it under their control, but their attempts failed. Then Da Vinci proposed an idea. Naturally, it was ambitious. Da Vinci didn't conceive of any other kind. Pisa stands on the Arno River, which gives it access to the sea and, consequently, resources. Da Vinci's idea was to change the river's course. To do this, a massive trench had to be dug. To dig a massive trench, a massive machine had to be built. Need it be said that the project failed? The inability to bring his ambitious ideas to life was perhaps Leonardo's greatest weakness. Having conceived a brilliant concept, he quickly lost interest in it. Moreover, by that time, he had already begun working on a new major project that had every chance of becoming the defining one of his life. In 1504, perhaps the greatest art battle in history began: Da Vinci versus Michelangelo. Both artists were commissioned to paint a wall in the same Florentine palace, literally across from each other. What makes this battle truly fascinating is the context. Da Vinci and Michelangelo were distinct artists from different generations and very different people. At the time, Leonardo was 51, Michelangelo was 28. Da Vinci was a vibrant, stylish, sociable man. Michelangelo was a disheveled, stooped, reclusive young man who, despite this, was already considered a genius and received many commissions. Leonardo rarely criticized other artists' work, but not in this instance. In his opinion, Michelangelo's nudes looked like sacks of walnuts, too chiseled, lacking the sfumato, plasticity, and everything Da Vinci valued. Michelangelo did not argue much. He primarily saw himself as a sculptor and applied that approach to his painting. For his fresco, Leonardo chose the Battle of Anghiari, a significant event for Florentines. Leonardo, already prone to pushing his perfectionism to the extreme, was likely driven to the edge in open rivalry with the young star. He once again dissected dead horses and people, making sketches of both. In his diaries, he experimented with paints again, procrastinated again, and missed deadlines again. During the work on the fresco, Leonardo's father died. Their relationship wasn't exactly ideal, but his father often brought him clients. Leonardo frequently failed to complete these commissions, and Piero da Vinci never recognized Leonardo as his legitimate son, despite having a dozen other children, and left him no inheritance. After his father's death, Da Vinci continued working on the Battle of Anghiari. Michelangelo, on the opposite wall, painted another battle. A few years later, this versus battle ended strangely. Both artists abandoned their unfinished works, and neither survived. This is what Michelangelo's fresco might have looked like. This is Da Vinci's. Both images are merely copies made by other artists who could observe the geniuses at work. In the end, Michelangelo went to Rome to paint the Sistine Chapel, and Leonardo returned to Milan. Once again, he left a project unfinished, despite a strict contract. This meant it was unlikely he would ever receive another major commission. When did Leonardo realize his mortality? Both parents were buried, and he had little connection with his siblings. His relationship with Salai was never perfect, largely due to the latter's difficult character. During this period, Da Vinci met Francesco Melzi, who became not only his student but also, in essence, his adopted son. Melzi would accompany Leonardo until the end of his life, become an artist, and eventually inherit most of Da Vinci's estate. In 1508, Leonardo was living in Milan again and devoting nearly all his time to science. There's a known case of a centenarian who simply died of old age. Da Vinci couldn't pass it by. In his diary, he meticulously sketched the muscles, veins, and a partial portrait of the deceased. This marked the start of a new 5-year period of obsession with anatomy. Picture this: a 56-year-old genius, likely in pink clothing, rushing from one hospital to another, dissecting corpses. Fortunately, by that time, the church no longer strongly opposed such operations, at least in progressive cities like Milan and Florence. Perhaps during this period, Da Vinci came closest to being remembered not only as an artist, but also as a scientist. He was one of the first to describe certain aspects of the brain's structure, realized that the heart is the center of the circulatory system, and discovered new heart valves. Da Vinci planned to turn all this into scientific treatises. Did he complete them? Of course not. Should we be surprised? A typical page from the genius's diary looks like this: a detailed sketch of a hand muscle, facial muscles, notes, and at the bottom, a portrait of some random person who likely had nothing to do with the above. Leonardo probably just got distracted. Concepts interested Da Vinci far more. Remember the Vitruvian Man and the theory that everything in our body is structured like the world around us? Well, Leonardo constantly sought analogies. He compared the flow of blood in arteries to the flow of water in rivers, the structure of veins to tree roots, the movement of planets to the movement of muscles, and so on. Toward the end of his life, he realized he was wrong. Most of these theories and analogies simply didn't work. However, failures and the ability to acknowledge them are an integral part of genius. It's hard to imagine the process of discovery without hypotheses and theories. But in the 16th century, not all ideas were met with enthusiasm. Da Vinci's diaries contain heretical thoughts, such as the notion that the sun doesn't move or that a fetus is merely part of the mother's body and thus cannot have its own soul. However, Leonardo never sought to offend religious sentiments. He only wanted to answer questions about the universe and humanity's place in it. Da Vinci believed in the divine origin of life, but preferred to study the world through science and art, not church dogma. In 1512, Da Vinci turned 60. There are two conflicting portraits from that period, one by a student, the other by Leonardo himself. Both depict Da Vinci at the same age, yet the people in these portraits seem 20 years apart. One possible explanation is that the student may have flattered the teacher, a 16th century Photoshop master. Additionally, accounts from people who met Da Vinci at the time recall that he looked much older than his years. Perhaps he aged prematurely, and the self-portrait is closer to the truth. Or maybe in the self-portrait, Da Vinci depicted his inner sense of self, not his actual appearance. A year after turning 60, Da Vinci moved to Rome. With him went Salai, Francesco Melzi, and other students. Leonardo found a new patron, took rare commissions, but didn't complete them. In his notes from that time, he complained about his students, who either did poor work or left to start their own workshops. From the time Leonardo began working on the Mona Lisa until his death, 16 years passed. This period includes only a few works, such as John the Baptist. The first thing that stands out is not the signature sfumato, but the pointing finger. It appears regularly in Da Vinci's paintings. The explanation is simple. The figure is pointing to the sky, indicating something divine. At the same time, Leonardo was finishing Saint, and with the Madonna and Child Christ. This work began around the same time as the Mona Lisa. Some believe this masterpiece is no less great, just less famous. Whether that's true is debatable. What is certain is that the level of detail, the number of layers, is no less than in the Mona Lisa. The number of figures is greater, and their movement is more complex. Perhaps during this and earlier periods, Da Vinci created more masterpieces, but there's a problem. Leonardo, like many artists of his time, didn't sign his works. Moreover, in his diaries, he rarely mentioned what he was working on at any given moment. In Wikipedia articles about this, or that masterpiece, you'll often find the vague phrase, "The painting is believed to be by the hand of Leonardo da Vinci." Behind this short sentence lies a vast, mysterious territory for mere mortals called the art market. In 1900, a painting called Solvitor Mundi was discovered in Britain. It was in poor condition and not considered a great masterpiece. It was attributed to one of Da Vinci's students. In the mid-20th century, it sold for $100. Remember that figure. 50 years later, in the new millennium, a theory emerged that the author was not a student but Leonardo himself. Experts gathered, complex technical analyses were conducted, and in 2013, Solvitor Mundi, now attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, was purchased by a Russian billionaire who made his fortune in fertilizer production. The deal was for $127 million. For years later, a Saudi prince purchased it for $450 million. Solvitor Mundi became the most expensive work of art ever sold at auction. What's the main takeaway from this story? Firstly, fertilizer production is a very lucrative business. Secondly, some experts still consider the entire Solvitor Mundi saga the greatest scam in the history of the art market. Here's why. Determining the authorship of a painting relies on experts, and one of their criteria is intuition, a sixth sense. True story. Take Solvitor Mundi. Some experts look at the painting and note the signature sfumato, the detailed rendering of fabric and hair, classic Da Vinci. Another group, no less respected, counters. Leonardo would unlikely have depicted the figure frontally, he preferred three-quarter poses. And look at the orb in the hand. A scientifically minded Da Vinci would have known that a glass orb distorts objects behind it. We should see the hand inverted. The first group responds, "Guys, a genius is a genius." He deliberately depicted the hand behind the orb in violation of physics because he knew otherwise it would distract the viewer. Who's right? It's still unclear. However, the experts denying Da Vinci's authorship are in the strong minority. The painting whose authorship is unquestioned is the Mona Lisa. But what raises doubts, according to many internet users, is the degree of its masterpiece status. You'll often find varied comments on YouTube. Some love it, some don't. For me, the Mona Lisa is okay. It's time for a clear answer. The Mona Lisa is, of course, a masterpiece. It may not appeal to everyone, and that's fine. Yes, its immense popularity is tied to its theft in the early 20th century. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. In summary, dozens of world masterpieces have been stolen and returned. Can they rival the Mona Lisa in fame? That's the rhetorical question. Look at two paintings, Ginevra da Vinci, which Leonardo painted in Florence when he was about 25, a good work by a talented artist, but the Mona Lisa is a masterpiece by a genius. Between these two works lie decades of studying optics, anatomy, geology, and other disciplines. All the knowledge and experience Da Vinci accumulated over the years, centuries haven't passed without a trace for the Mona Lisa. Her face likely lost its eyebrows due to one of the restorations, and the colors have yellowed and faded. The blame lies with the genius's experiments with paints. In the museum, there's a copy of the Mona Lisa, likely painted by one of his students. Thanks to it, we can roughly imagine what the colors of the Mona Lisa were like 500 years ago. By the way, the famous following gaze wasn't invented by Da Vinci. This technique, where the figure looks at the viewer from any angle, was used before Leonardo. However, today this effect is associated with the Mona Lisa. But the most important thing, the Mona Lisa is a kind of culmination of the artist's life, decades of research, trials, and errors. Perhaps that's why Leonardo never gave it to the client and kept refining it. For Da Vinci, good enough was never good enough. In 1515, Leonardo accepted an invitation from a new patron, King Francis I of France. Da Vinci left Italy for the first time in his life. Salai stayed in Milan. Leonardo's new home was a small castle in France. King Francis I was the ideal patron Da Vinci had awaited his entire life: comfortable living conditions, a generous stipend, and, most importantly, no deadlines. In return, the genius was named the king's chief engineer, artist, and architect. Leonardo spent his final years in his castle, occasionally receiving guests. Some noted clear signs of a stroke and a paralyzed hand. The logical conclusion: he could no longer paint. However, it was his right hand that was paralyzed, and Da Vinci was left-handed. Most likely, he continued working until the end. One of his last projects was a concept for an entire city for King Francis. Da Vinci didn't live to complete it. Once, Leonardo wrote in his diary, "As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a well-spent life brings a happy death." He died in May 1519 and was buried in the castle's church. In the 19th century, the church was destroyed, and half a century later, remains were excavated and reburied in another church. It's presumed these remains belonged to Leonardo da Vinci, but no one knows for sure. This mystery perfectly fits the story of a man about whom much remains unknown. But what is certain is that Leonardo was a genius. True, he didn't become one immediately and not in everything. Long ago, I heard the idea that artists and scientists, in fact, seek answers to the same questions, but in different ways. Who are we? Where do we come from? And what is our place in the universe? Usually, these artists and scientists are different people, but Leonardo combined both with varying degrees of success.